All right, everybody. I am so glad that you are here, and thank you for joining us on Zoom on a Thursday night. What is even? We're here to celebrate Meridel Newton's book launch for The Future Second by Second. Yay. Which is book one of the Shelter trilogy, which is like our first trilogy. At IFP, which is really cool. So Interstellar Flight Press, we publish mostly small books, so novellas and poetry collections, and we just finished a short story collection call that is with our guest editor, so people should be hearing from that soon, and that's exciting. And yeah, we're based here in Houston, and we want to say thanks for joining us to celebrate with Meridel. And let me introduce Meridel. Meridel Newton's day job is as a research analyst, which I don't know what that is, but it sounds cool. And she lives in Washington, D.C., and her writing has previously appeared in the 1001 Ninth Anthology, Recognized Fascism, as well as a self-published YA fantasy novel, The Puppet Kingdom. And we're very glad to welcome Meridel, and Meridel is going to read for a little bit from her book and also some other stuff. So everybody hang out and enjoy yourself. And I'm going to close my video
now. Yeah, hello everyone, welcome. It's good to see a lot of familiar names. I thought I would open up with a really short introductory sort of story/poem, and then I would read a selection from the novella. So please enjoy. This one is technically untitled. So, there's a small brown bird who lives at the bottom of the world, and the cries of the people echo down the years to her nest. She cocks her head and listens, and sings back what she can. Comfort to the lonely, strength to the despairing, love to the heartbroken. She flutters her wings and sends tiny, airy riffles back against the sound, butterfly chaos to change what she can. She smooths her feathers, plucks out the matted down, and lets it float up to the world above, soft and delicate and warm against the frigid fear. She is only one little bird, life-proof against the black tide of the world, delicate yet strong through all human history. She does what she can to heal the ill, guide the lost, stay the hand of violence. And so can you. Okay. So that was something that I wrote about 5 years ago now, when we were in the midst of the 2016 election campaign, and also seems somewhat relevant today and now, and this week specifically. So thank you. I will switch gears now and start reading from the novella. Some of you have read some of it before, but hopefully this is new to you, and I hope you enjoy it. If you don't know, this novella is post-apocalyptic. It's set about 80 years after the apocalyptic event. And it is set in a town called Osto. "8 a.m. The first thing Vasha did in the morning was wind her watch. The smooth roll of the knob, the infinitesimal clicks of the gears, the subtle tension of the spring as it pulled tighter and tighter. She awoke with the watch, her consciousness emerging from sleep as the flow of time was put to rights. It was a ritual, and rituals were important in this disordered age. You needed a regularity to your habits. This morning activity helped set the rest of the day on its rightful track, each tick of the watch's hand counting away the seconds and minutes, keeping some semblance of peace and order in the world. Vasha figured out long ago that a full wind of the watch lasted 36 hours. More than enough, or it should have been, to merit just one winding a day. Yet she always made sure to spin the tiny knob a few times before she drifted off to sleep. Sometimes during the day, she would reach into her pocket and wrap her fingers around the reassuring weight of the silvery disc, skimming her thumb across the knob with the absent fondness with which one might greet a faithful old pet. Gentle, dear, love between you long established, but she'd had the watch far longer than she'd ever had any animal. It came to her from her father, who had remembered a time when he thought it foolish curiosity. Once, he told her, it had been covered in gold, and he wore it on a chain clipped to the vest the color of pine trees. It was jewelry, adornment, a mere accessory. He'd barely even used it to tell the time. He'd had something else for that, something he'd called a phone, and the stories he told her of that were nothing short of magic. But then none of the magic of the old world saved the phones or the people who carried them. That time was gone. The gold had flaked off. No use dwelling on children's stories. The spring held tight. She gave the watch one last fond squeeze and dropped it into an inside pocket. The temperature had dropped overnight, and her breath clouded in the air. They would need to draw the blankets over the windows and check all the walls for drafts soon. The cold was coming on, and she was determined that this time, finally, they would be fully prepared. The year had been a good one so far. Crops thrived and ripened in the fields. What animals they kept grew fat and content. A couple of the goats had even kidded more than once, guaranteeing a supply of meat and dairy that had once been uncertain. For the first time since she could remember, the prospect of the coming winter did not make her throat tighten with anxiety. Vasha took a deep breath, steeling herself, and hauled her body upright. She dropped her feet to the floor and stretched, feeling the reluctance of each bone in her spine and each sinew of muscle, and then hauled herself out of bed. She felt a moment of disorientation, a quick dizziness, perhaps not enough iron in her diet. She'd have to check on the spinach harvest, maybe see if anyone had brought in deer or a rabbit in the past few days. She had felt the oncoming cold in her bones last night and had not bothered to shed any of her layers of clothing before sleep. They hung on her scant frame, adding weight and bulk that almost canceled out the advantage of warmth. Almost, but not quite. Vasha ran her hands through short cropped hair, working out the night tangles, more silver than black in the thin threads, but some color held on stubbornly through all the years. The cane she took up, however, was no concession to age. She had been born with a clubfoot and had required assistance to walk for as long as she could remember. Once she was sure of her footing, she shuffled to the door and pushed it open. Just on the other side lay the shelter, her life's work, her own small domain, the beating heart of the village of Osto. Most of the residents woke with the sun and were already going about their day, leaving the maze of family allotments empty. A few clusters of villagers gathered, talking and planning before starting the work of the day. Old Ben tended the community kitchens by the largest windows in the public square, churning out a steady supply of, she sniffed, wheat flatbread and potato paste, filling but uninteresting. A group of teenage artisans sat by the open main doors of the village, gossiping as they tended to their spinning. The huge steel door panels were flung wide, allowing the frigid air and pale morning sunlight in with the laborers as they hurried to finish the late fall harvest. In the crisp brilliance of the new day, Vasha felt her heart lift. Everything was ticking along perfectly. Her people knew their jobs, knew the roles they filled to keep the village prospering. In this chaotic and uncertain world, they all worked to make Osto an oasis of peace. "Morning, Vasha," old Ben called. He held out a thick slice of bread and tater paste as she approached. Ben had presided over the square of mismatched counters and cabinets known as the kitchens for as long as anyone could remember, and for all that time, he and his assistants supplied breakfasts and dinners for everyone every day. The food varied with the season and the weather and the harvest, but it was always there, always fairly portioned to all. He ruled his domain with a firm authority that even the young ones respected. No one wanted to be banned from the kitchens. And with brick ovens built into the walls and the near constant stew fire, it was usually the warmest place in the village, making it one of Vasha's favorite places. "Morning, Ben," she answered, accepting the bread, then taking a huge bite and chewing fast enough that she didn't have to taste the bland staple. "How's it going?" He shook his head. "We still have most of the north fields to clear, but the weather folks say they're getting a bad storm in soon. Maybe tonight, maybe lose the last of the wheat." That would be a damn shame. It had been a good year, warm early and late, and no sudden freezes. They wouldn't feel the pinch if they lost that wheat, but Vasha had been pleased to head into the cold months with such a surplus. "We'll have the patrols and double up the field teams today, then." "What else?" Old Ben grinned. He was a better newsman than cook, and he knew it. A couple sheep wandered off overnight. Dever thinks we got wolves or coyotes. She's organizing some hunters to go looking for them. Vasha nodded thoughtfully. The flock had been twitchy for a few days now, worrying at the shepherds. With the cold weather coming in, whatever was out there would only be getting more aggressive. Let's hope they find what they're looking for. Ben offered her another slice, and she shook her head. Something in the deep lines of his face told her what came next would be bad. 2 kids ran off overnight, he said. The Newsom girl and Umair Bly. You're kidding. A Bly and an outsider? An outlier? No shit. The larger and older families of Osto had expanded out from the shelter into some of the surrounding ruins over the years. They sought space and privacy, but sacrificed the easy security of the fortified village center. The outlying families were still a part of the work and life of the village, but they had deliberately set themselves apart, and some of them took that a little too far. What did the parents say? Jonathan Newsom is here. Ben nodded his head at a knot of men who had stationed themselves along a side wall. He says the Blys are trying to steal his workers, and less friendly things. Haven't heard from Amaya or Cedric yet. In the dim light of dawn, beyond the cook fire's light and away from any of the narrow windows, John Newsom and 2 of his older sons were gathered in conversation. All 3 were tall, hulking men with low brows perpetually sunburned. The younger Newsoms, she thought these 2 were Adam and Jacob, were sandy-haired and hale men in their 20s, handsome but for their dour expressions. John had been built as powerfully as his sons once, but time and age and a life of hard labor had taken their tolls, bending his back and thinning his hair. On him, the dourness had settled into the lines of his face long ago, less a fleeting expression and more a regular feature. In the lurking gloom, they looked like trouble in waiting. Vasha closed her eyes, suppressing a heavy sigh. The Newsoms were important members of the community, she reminded herself, hard and reliable workers, even if their feud with the Blys had nearly destroyed the village once already, not so long ago. I'll look into it, she said. Just as she was about to ask for any last tidbit he might have to offer, the head-splitting clangor of the village alarm, a recent construction of scavenged metal and stones perched on the roof, tore through the morning's peace. Half a second later, a breathless patrolman nearly fell through the open door, clinging to the wall to stay upright. Riders, he managed. Raiders, coming in from the east. His words fell loud and clear in the sudden silence after the alarm. Vasha bolted upright. Coming in from the east, where the sun rose, hiding them as they made their approach. These would be smart ones then. How many? How far? The patrolman, barely more than a boy really, gasped as he struggled to catch his breath. At least 100. Still far, maybe 3 clicks, but on horseback. Weapons? He nodded. Bows and blades, and armor, mostly leather. To keep that many riders together for any length of time meant a strong leader, and it also meant hungry mouths and other needs to fill. These men were no ordinary wolf pack. They were organized, prepared. They'd come for the harvest, possibly the women, possibly the shelter itself. Vasha swore to herself as she calculated. Jack, Raleigh, go to the northern fields and tell everyone to grab what they can and get in here. Newsom, you go round up the outliers as quick as you can and bring them in. And so you get all of them, mind. The 2 chosen boys ran off as soon as they had their assignments. The Newsom men grimaced but nodded and turned to go. Whatever their other issues might be, they could wait until danger passed. She turned to the remaining villagers, all watching her in rapt silence. With field hands, patrols, and hunters already at work, the common area mainly held the old, the young, and the handicrafters. A weaver boy nearly dropped a spindle from prone fingers as she caught his eyes. She pointed at him, then gestured to include the other young artisans gathered near him. You lot, round up the animals and get them all in the stables. Don't forget to secure the back doors. Get! She turned to the next group, older and more familiar with Osto's siege procedure. You all, get the windows fortified and bring out the candles. Candles, not oil lamps. It was too close to winter to be wasting their scant oil supplies on a raid like this. Where's? Ah, clever boy. She tried not to play favorites, but Ahmed made it very difficult sometimes. Looks like we might be ready to test your water storage sooner than we thought. Is it ready? The dark-skinned boy nodded, his black hair falling into his eyes. We've been collecting rainwater for the last month, he said. The cistern's nearly full, and I've been testing the drainage. 3 people should be able to empty the whole thing in a few minutes, and the filters on the indoor tanks are ready. Vasha pointed at 2 of the dwindling crowd. See to it, she said, and the 3 of them left to secure the water supply. That left her with old Ben, who hurried to douse the kitchen fires and close the ovens, and a young couple, Danica and Lonnie. The taller woman held a baby in her arms, born just last week. Both parents looked pale and scared. Vasha's expression softened as she looked at them. They were new arrivals to Osto, survivors from some previous village destroyed by raiders. They had been grateful beyond measure when she'd said they could stay. Perhaps they were only just now realizing what it meant to have a child in a world like this, where there was no such thing as a true haven. Don't you worry, she said, her voice gruff as she tried to speak quietly. Osto has seen a lot worse than this and come through just fine. Which maybe wasn't quite true, but they were for sure better prepared for it this time than they'd ever been before. Vasha's hand found its way to her pocket and to the watch tucked within. The knob refused to turn against her thumb. It hadn't even been long enough for the spring to loosen. It hummed quietly in her palm. Hurry, hurry, the pulse seemed to say. The shelter of Osto was a single gigantic concrete structure, a squat, ugly block of a place. Her father had told her it had once been an immense storehouse, filled with food and furniture and any kind of creature comfort one could barter for. In those days, he'd said, people came with plans to go in and get out as quickly as possible, never wanting to stay any longer than they had to. Now, almost 200 people called the shelter home. The cavernous central hall, murky and echoing, was sectioned off into dozens of small, semi-private family allotments, which crowded against the public square at the front of the building. A few built-in rooms around the perimeter of the main hall served mostly for storage and animal housing. Only Vasha, longtime leader of the village, had a fully private space consisting of a door and solid concrete walls. And even there, most of her so-called furniture was filled with stored grain, potatoes, and water, their most precious resources. Osto was an oasis, united by the understanding that together, all had a better chance of survival in a broken world. Few such places existed anymore, and even fewer could claim the long history of unquestioning welcome and inclusion that had seen them through so many hard years. Osto stood for safety, for peace. And now their peace was threatened, but they were prepared to defend it. Vasha's orders were familiar from years of drills and previous raids. Each villager had their role to play, their function to fulfill. It was almost satisfying to watch as villagers secured large sheets of metal across each of the narrow windows, as children lit candles, as field workers and outliers streamed in to huddle in the shelter they had built together, ready to wait out this latest incursion. On her third count, Vasha finally nodded. Not all the villagers were safe within her walls. The patrols still walked the routes, but they would be wise enough to keep to the woods once they spotted the horses. Devra's hunters, at least, had been within earshot of the alarms. As for the missing teens, Vasha shook her head. There was nothing to be done for them now. Hopefully they would also be smart enough to avoid the raiders and clever enough to survive on their own for however long it took. At her order, 4 heavily muscled laborers dragged 2 solid steel sheets over the main doors and locked them in place. Darkness descended, lit only by the small flames of candles and cook fires. Darkness, but not quiet. Soft, muffled conversations filled the room. Small noises of industry, busy work to keep minds occupied and away from worry over the coming raid. Vasha heard the steady click-whir clatter of the loom, the crackle of the ever-burning stew fire, now banked low and fed with soft, dry wood to avoid smoke. She imagined she could hear the tiny tick-tick-tick of her father's watch and resisted the urge to reach for it again. The wait was terrible, but it wasn't long. The roaring approach of armored horses and armed riders was unmistakable even through concrete and steel. The village grew truly silent, hundreds of ears straining to hear, hundreds of minds wondering if today would be their last day. It would not be. She'd see to that. People of Osto, The voice was male, deep and strong, the sort of voice that belonged to a man with broad shoulders and a deep chest. It rang through the village clear as day. We heard stories about this place and came a long way to see the truth for ourselves. Stories of a village that flourished and welcomed all who would join it. But now we find your doors closed to us. Were the stories wrong? A susurrus swept the crowd inside, but it died as Vasha made her way to a window. It was fortified, as the others were, with thick plates of steel, a legacy of her father's leadership. But the front windows were wider than the others, and to cover them required multiple plates strapped together with thick leather. These narrow joints let her voice reach the outside without strain. Osto welcomes wanderers and travelers and all who come in peace, but not your kind, not raiders. Raiders? We're not raiders. We're Esteban's men. Perhaps you've heard of us. A question that was not truly a question. Of course she'd heard of them. Everyone had. Esteban's men had been riding since her father's time. They were renowned for their cruelty and their merciless destruction, their singular focus, and their unusual persistence. Once they had fixed on a target, they did not leave until that target was razed to the ground. One could choose to join them, but that was a different kind of defeat. Only one man had ever left the men alive. Isn't this a little far east for you? Vasha called. There was a clatter and a low growl of words she could not make out. Then the same voice answered, The West gets worse every year. Thin soil, raging fires, but we heard rumors brought us here. Rumors of riches in the East, abundant food and children without hunger, whole villages thriving in this wretched world, strong men and beautiful women. A swell of laughter accompanied this last, but it wasn't enough to distract Vasha. The man's words were well chosen and erudite, yet rough enough to appeal to uneducated raider scum. The speaker, she was certain, was also the one who had planned the attack, circling the village to come out of the rising sun. The leader, and he not only spoke to her, but for his men, keeping them rallied to his cause. And you come with an army, with weapons and fighters. We know your kind well, raider. You will not destroy what we've built here. There was a burst of angry noise from the outside. Vasha counted four voices raised an argument. Then that clear, strong voice rose, and they fell silent. A leader indeed, and a respected one, though with a fractious counsel. We come in friendship, Osto. We came to share in your good fortune, not to destroy it. Friends don't come with drawn knives, Vasha said, and it was as much for the benefit of her people as his. She couldn't risk discord in the village, no faint hearts willing to appease rather than stand up for their homes and their lives. There was no appeasement for the sort who joined Esteban's men. There was only the chance to meet strength with strength, to fight for what was yours. But sometimes, there could be more than one kind of strength, and more than one way to fight. We can wait you out, you know, the voice said, and she heard the note of weariness he failed to mask. We have the whole place surrounded. We have your fields already, and those lovely buildings you left open for us. We can be patient. Vasha laughed, pitching it to fill the room and echo off the walls. Strength. She needed to show her people strength in all its guises. Confidence, certainty, courage. How long can you wait, toy soldier? We have everything we need here. We have food and water to last us for months. And you have an army to feed. And winter is coming. She listened hard, but could not make out any of the subsequent discussion. The answer, when it came, was expected. He, too, had to show confidence. He led only so long as his riders recognized his right to lead. It's early yet, Osto. Your pretty words sound brave now, but we'll see how you feel at the end of the day as your crops rot in the fields. You think we'll change our minds so quickly? Vasha hoped her scorn was obvious through the thick walls. One day, the voice said. Let us in by sunset, or you'll never see another one. The end of the day, and then what? With so many men, he would have to move quickly. There was no way they had enough food themselves to plan a siege. Even with the unharvested grain and potatoes in the north fields, they would need more food if they meant to stay very long. And with the storm coming, they hardly even had those scant crops. Did they really think they could attack? They only carried weapons for person-to-person combat, according to the patrols. Osto was built of solid concrete, pierced only by a few sparse windows and the front and back doors. The steel fortifications had been improvised back in her father's day, the product of a particularly successful foraging expedition and a great deal of ingenuity. Vasha couldn't imagine what purpose the heavy sheets of steel had originally served, but there was much about the world before that she didn't understand. What mattered was that they were thick and sturdy, almost as solid as the walls themselves, and they near instantly turned Osto into a fortified, self-reliant stronghold. Even the animals sheltered in the back of the building, in a former storage room walled off from the living area. Their musk permeated the village, but it was a small price to pay to shield the sheep, the goats, and chickens. With them, all her people could be fed and clothed. All her people were safe. Almost all. Gabrielle Newsom and Umair Bly were still out there. The raiders had arrived before she'd even had a chance to think about the missing teens. Vasha grimaced to herself. They were strong, smart kids, both trained to hunt and unafraid of hard work. They'd lived through other raids. Hopefully they'd have the good sense to stay away from the village while armed strangers surrounded it. That was what she had to tell herself. The alternative was unthinkable. But their families were still here. The Newsoms were an old Osto family, present for 3 generations and working on the 4th, and they had prospered and multiplied in all that time. The Blys were newer by comparison. Amaya and Cedric had arrived with 3 children in tow, the boys Umair and Reggie, and then tiny Jess. They had been warmly welcomed by all and proved to be an asset to the village. Or so it had been until 2 years ago. 2 years ago, the Blys asked to move from the shelter to an outlying building, and Vasha had agreed. For months, the people of Osto had worked to restore one of the dilapidated structures, to stabilize the walls, secure the doors and windows, and fill it with the essential furnishings a family would need on its own. It was a heavy imposition on top of the daily struggle of survival, but many hands willingly contributed. Then, only days before the building was at last ready for the Bly family to move in, the Newsoms made their move. They'd called a council and claimed insult, saying the new building should be theirs by rights. They'd cited their tenure in the village and how many laborers they had produced, how much work they had done to benefit others. The fight was loud and long, but in the end, the Blys stepped aside and the Newsoms won out. And ever since, Vasha had been careful to ensure that no work shift or patrol included both the Newsom and a Bly. They could barely tolerate being in the same room with each other at the best of times. Now they had no choice. Vasha made her way slowly across the floor. The villagers had created a circle of tall pillar candles in the center of the building, clustering around the warmth and light. The Newsoms, 23 of them if you included those who'd married in, stood in a clump, the younger ones wide-eyed and anxious. The older Newsoms looked wary and mean, old resentment simmering underneath the surface and threatening to ensnare any who crossed their sight. Jonathan? Vasha nodded acknowledgement of the Newsom patriarch. Jonathan Newsom was a hard man, his skin leathery and wrinkled from years of work in the sun. He looked at her with eyes like stone chips, and his voice contained not the barest hint of concession. Vasha, he said. Ma'am. Vasha stared back at the old man, weighing her options. She had more latitude during the raid than she might have otherwise, more expectation that her suggestions would be followed like orders. Her people know the importance of unifying in times of trouble. I hear there's trouble with your girl. Those damn Blys took her, he growled. That boy of theirs turned her head. Younger Newsom men rumbled in agreement. As I recall, Gabrielle is a bright girl of 17, Vasha said, layering her disapproval into her tone. More than old enough to make her own decisions in that regard. No, she ain't, Jonathan answered. She's a member of this family and she knows what that means. We got fields to tend, food to hunt. All of which, of course, you share fairly with the rest of Osto in acknowledgement of all these good people who have done to help you. He narrowed his eyes at that. at last grinding out, "Yes, of course, ma'am." Vasha nodded. She had long suspected the Newsomes of hoarding. No one had been so careful or so careless as to admit it in front of her just yet, though. "Umair is a good kid. Smart. He's the best hunter on his patrol shift." Jonathan snorted. "That good kid is going to get my girl killed." There was no way to deny the heightened danger presented by the raiders. "They won't go so far. Give them a few days to see how bad it is out there, and they'll come back on their own." "I hope you're right," said a soft voice at her elbow. Amaya Bly had approached during their conversation. She was a small woman, her dark eyes shaded by a hijab that may once have been a bright purple. Now she reached out to lay 2 fingers on Vasha's arm. "We had no idea. If he'd talked to us, we would have told him there was no need to run." "Bullshit." That was Jacob, Gabriel's brother. He looked like a younger, barrel-chested version of the old Newsom patriarch. "You people, if I may steal our esteemed headwoman away." This was old Ben, inserting himself so smoothly into the conversation that not even John Newsom could take exception. Vasha was glad for the escape. "Of course," she said, feeling her smile settle into something more real. "We can pick this up later, at a more appropriate time." Even so, she waited until Newsomes and Bly had accepted their dismissal and moved off in different directions before turning to old Ben, who beckoned her over to one of his ramshackle countertops. Without the fires going, the kitchens were strangely quiet and no warmer than the rest of the village. She sighed and settled her weight on her elbows. "Something I should know?" Old Ben shook his head, rueful, and pulled a couple rough-hewn stools over for them. "Nothing you don't know already," he said. "Raiders are people, same as anyone here." "People who have made very different choices," Vasha pointed out. She grimaced. "Choices that lead them to seek the destruction of everything we've built here." "Not necessarily," old Ben said. He waved her closer with a liver-spotted hand, and they bent their heads together in a play at privacy. "They made the choice they thought they needed to make to survive," he said. "But it doesn't take much of a taste of the raiding life to start to doubt, to wish for something different." Old Ben had been around longer than anyone else in the village and had probably made more bad choices than any 3 Austins combined. Vasha always appreciated his thoughts, especially on matters beyond the boundaries of the village. But she wasn't quite sure she understood where he was going with this. "The men have followed the same pattern for a long time now," she said. "Plunder, misery, no survivors." "They have," old Ben nodded. "But they're here now, and that's a break in their pattern. We're far from their usual territory, a long trip to make with winter coming on. It's a big change, one they wouldn't make without a reason. They're looking for something different, mark my words. They may not even realize it yet, but they're looking for something." Vasha frowned as she thought this over. There was a kernel of a thought there, something to tease out given time. "Osto!" The word boomed through the shelter. As one, the villagers looked up, turning toward the doors. Vasha caught her breath. "What now?" "I've lost my patience. Surrender now, or we attack." Vasha huffed to herself, annoyed for all the wrong reasons. "You said 1 day." She stumped across the floor with single-minded determination, the crowd parting before her. At the window, she yelled again, "You said 1 day." There was a laugh. "But why wait? We have the numbers. We have the force. You come out or we're coming in." "My mistake," grumbled Vasha. "I thought I was dealing with an honorable man." The words were out before she could think better of them, but instead of the scorn she would have expected, there was a pause. "What's that?" "He listened?" Vasha's thoughts raced. Why would he listen to that? "You said you came as friends. You gave us a day. Are you going back on your word?" "I never gave my word," came the response. He had changed the ultimatum so quickly, yet the truth seemed to bother him. Perhaps there was more going on than she realized. Had he been pressured to change his strategy, maybe by those she'd heard arguing earlier? Perhaps Esteban's men were fractured, weak. Perhaps she was dealing not with a wolf pack, but with hyenas, constantly searching for any weakness in their leader. If that were the case, the leader would be insecure. He would need to prove himself constantly. He would need to prove his strength, going further and further to ensure his position, until someone found his weakness. That someone could be her. I have a proposal for you, she said, if you are an honorable man. Another long pause. She imagined a man, strong yet hunted, looking across his cackle of hyenas and weighing the threats. Who thought they could depose him? Who waited only for the right moment? He could not risk looking weak. The mere fact that he responded to her jibe, that said so much. This man thought of himself as honorable, or at least he wanted to be seen as such. He thought his word meant something when he gave it, and she could use that. What do you propose? Came the response at last. Vasha smiled. First, a show of good faith. A summit. We talk, face to face. There was a cry from the crowd at that, a young Austin unable to contain their dismay. That seemed to break the tension. In moments, she was surrounded by her villagers and their protestations. Vasha, you can't, what are you thinking? We need you. She shook her head at them and gestured them quiet before raising her voice again. Well, would I have safe passage for a summit? Silence fell as she waited for the leader's answer. You have my word. Come out and no harm will come to you. His word. She had it. She had him. Stan, the doors. The farmer stood close to her, almost at her elbow. She could see the objection starting in his eyes. Now, Stan. He was a good man. He dropped his eyes, nodding as he did so, and quickly organized several of the strongest young men to haul open one of the front doors. Others tried to argue, but she waved them off. Light fell into the building as the doors opened, almost dazzlingly bright after the prolonged dimness. Vasha positioned herself right in front and stepped out the instant the door was open wide enough. For a moment, she was blinded, and she leaned heavily on her cane as her eyes slowly adjusted to the sun. Then the scene came into focus. Esteban's men, ranked before her on fine, tall chargers. They were a dangerous lot, armed with a motley assortment of blades and bludgeons and thin, hungry faces. They were armored in black and blue, with mismatched plates covering shoulders or chests. Disciplined, prepared, and dangerous, and before her, their leader. Of all of them, only he had dismounted. He stood tall before her, decked in leather and hammered metal. He had a proud face, almost handsome, with high cheekbones and flashing dark eyes above a grizzled beard. He wore his hair long. It was dark, streaked with gray, yet she was certain that he was a younger man. A young man who had lived a hard life, outdoors and on the road in all weather. The life of a raider who had made his choices. Above all, her eyes widened. He carried 2 guns. At his hip, she recognized a small, practical revolver, and slung across his back was a larger rifle. Guns were rare these days, so rare that she had only heard of them in her father's stories. Yet there was no mistaking the deadly sleekness of the weapons or the pride with which he displayed them. She made an odd match for him, she knew. An old woman, limping with a cane and dressed in soft, shapeless fabrics. Yet she, too, was a leader in this broken world. As if in proof, she heard footsteps behind her as some of her people followed her out. She risked a sideways glance. 3 of the older Newsom boys brandishing knives and threshers. Their presence made her stand a little taller. I am Vasha of Osto, she said, granting him a small nod. Drake of Esteban's men, he answered. Silence. He may be willing to negotiate, but he was expecting her to make the opening bid. She made her way over to an old stump and sat down, forcing him to follow. He remained standing, towering over her as she made herself comfortable. The Newsom was made to follow her, but she shook her head to warn them off. She could feel the eyes of every member of her village watching her, 100 tiny pinpricks on her back, her neck, her arms. She held their fate in her hands. No, in her words. Her words and her gamble. I am an old woman, Drake, she started, as you can see, and I've been looking for a successor. A murmur ran through the villagers behind her. This wasn't news to them, of course. It couldn't be. But what must they be thinking? They couldn't believe she would live forever. Drake didn't seem to believe it either. The fame of Osto has spread far for many years. It is known to be stable, safe. Vasha inclined her head in acknowledgement. Osto prospered since before you or I were born. I have led for decades, and my father led before me. But I have no children, and with no clear successor, Drake twitched his shoulders in a way that made his armor creak. You expect me to believe that you want to turn over leadership to me? No, she said, shaking her head to hide her smile. Not just like that. Of course not. Then what are you proposing? Something mutually beneficial. That is, if you are an honorable man. I'm listening, Drake snapped. Out with it. She had him. Here before all his men and all her people, she had him. Give me a minute. I'm an old woman, she said. I've lived to a ripe old age here in Osto, as have many of us. Laying it on a bit too thick, perhaps, she bit back the rest of what she'd planned to say. Drake's eyes narrowed as he waited. One day, Vasha said, that is what you promised us, and that is what we want. And Vasha leaned her head to the side as though considering. You said you came in friendship, to share what we had. You want a safe place to winter. I want to retire, knowing my people are safe. Say what you mean, old woman, Drake growled. We are a commune, Vasha said. I lead, but only with the agreement of my people. They chose me. They know me. They know how I lead. So I propose an election. Drake's face was blank and unreadable. What are you playing at? One day, Vasha said, working to keep the smile out of her voice. You lead Osto for one day. There is much to be done, and not long to do it before the weather turns. The harvest is unfinished, and our supplies need to be replenished. We need to hunt, and we need to build. So you lead us for one day. Show us how you would lead through the coming winter. At midnight, we vote. Drake's hands wandered to his hip to rest on the butt of his revolver. This does not sound like an election I can win. Osto will never accept a leader who does not win a majority. If you want to be a true leader here, if you want to lead the people with no resistance, you need to win our favor. You could have it all, everything you see here, without a fight. She paused before offering the final, irresistible lure. Your men, of course, would have an equal vote. Drake raised an eyebrow. Vasha shook her head. You have what, 140 men here? 150. He nodded, a single short tilt of his chin. Vasha waved behind her, taking in the bristling Newsom men and all others waiting inside. I have 180 back there. Many of them dislike me. Many of them would be happy to follow a strong man, a younger man. He turned to take a longer look at the village. She knew what he saw. At the center of Osto was the shelter, a sprawling gray box of a building with few windows and fewer doors. Not attractive, perhaps, but strong and very easy to defend. The roof held strange structures, their water system and perimeter alarm, as well as other unknowable machinery designed by their own resident tinkerer and inventor. A few other buildings clustered around the shelter containing stored food and farm tools. All around them lay evidence of their industry, fields and packed dirt roads and compost piles. People crowded the doorway, women and children, men and boys. Osto, as these things went, was rich beyond measure, secure, well-provisioned, well-positioned. And if the Newsomes were an example of the people inside, it might even be better defended than he was prepared to face. She was offering him a chance to win all this bounty with no loss of life on either side. It was no real choice at all. We will grant you 1 day to show that you can lead, Vasha said. She pulled out the pocket watch and, as she had expected, his eyes fixed on it with a hungry greed. 15 hours, from now until midnight. She paused. If, that is, you are a man of your word. 15 hours, Drake echoed, and he pronounced the words as though he had little practice with them. On my word, and on yours. Vasha nodded. I will stand by the results of the election. I swear it. Drake held out his hand. On his wrist, just poking out from the edges of a sleeve, were the curves of a dark blue tattoo. Vasha frowned. She knew that mark. Well, Drake demanded. She held out her own hand, and they shook on the agreement. And that is the end of chapter 1, and I think I'll stop there. I don't know if we want to have a quick interlude or...
Yeah, that was great. I was just like listening along. Like, this book is like a hug. Like, I don't know how you've managed to make a like post-apocalyptic, like, you know, kind of dystopian-esque book that manages to feel super comforting and cozy. Like, that was kind of the thing that stood out to me when we were originally selecting it from the slush pile, which feels like forever ago. But I think at the beginning I forgot to introduce myself, by the way. So I'm Holly Lenoir Raphael, the managing editor at Interstellar Flight Press. And yeah, as I was saying, when I got to read this one, out of it got, you know, bumped, it was just like, I was like, oh yeah, this is totally different. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you got there and like what the influences were, because I know you had a lot of influences that kind of brought you to writing this sort of different type of post-civilization book. Yeah.
I've loved the idea of like the post-apocalyptic subgenre for a long time, for years and years and years, but I frequently found that I was actually really disappointed with the way that it always focused on war and people being terrible to each other and death and destruction. And it seemed like the underlying message of the entire genre was people are terrible at their base, and if you take civilization away from them, everybody will just resort to fighting and violence and killing each other. And I disagree with that. There were a few entries in the post-apocalyptic genre that I did really enjoy. They're few and far between, but when I find them and I read them, I just adore them. And what I adore about them is that they focus on community building. One that I never remember the author's name for this, but one that I particularly remember is The Green Book, which we read in elementary school. It actually is like a children's book, but it is about a group of settlers that go to, I think, Mars to settle in and build a colony. And so it's not technically post-apocalyptic, but it is dealing with a lot of the same pressures and a lot of the same issues that Osto does. Like, they need to find food, they need to find shelter, they need to find protection from various outside forces. And what I always really loved about it was how they worked together and solved problems. Another influence that is probably more familiar to people, especially some of the people in this session, is actually Dark Angel, which was a TV show that was directed by James Cameron. I think it was like late 90s, mid to late 90s, I would say. There were only 2 seasons of it. It was a big deal when it started airing. And it seems like it's kind of dropped out of popular consciousness since then. But it was post-apocalyptic. And the thing that I fell in love with there was just that it showed people surviving after the big event and rebuilding and creating new social structures. And the characters in that story were trying to figure out like what they were going to do. They were building new businesses. They were figuring out how to reuse, repurpose things that they found from like the old world. And I loved that shit. That is what I love the most about the entire idea of the post-apocalyptic genre, and I want more of it. And it just seems like it's not really easy to find.
Yeah, it reminds me of like one of my favorite video games is Don't Starve. I don't know if you've ever played this, but like the whole goal is just to like not die and like to find resources and build things and like, you know, that kind of like survival thing. And I feel like that gets overlooked a lot. But yeah, I think that your book is very like hopeful and embracing of this idea that we need communal solutions to the problems that we have today. You know, like I do some zero waste climate change, you know, try to prevent climate change in my own little way stuff. And I spend a lot of time like with on my, you know, Facebook community groups, you know, finding ways to like reuse things or like find things that I can reuse. And that kind of community I feel like is really often overlooked, and it's so refreshing in your book. And I'm very excited that there's going to be 2 more. So I wanted to ask you, so one feature of the book is that each chapter is not really a chapter heading, but is an hour in the day. And that becomes like really important as this sort of like ticking, you know, clock. And I was curious how you kind of came up with that and that idea.
The image of the stopwatch and the clock was basically what the entire story was built around in a weird way. I mentioned this in the interview that I published with Interstellar Flight Press magazine, actually, which is that this whole novella started off as just an exercise, a writing exercise, because I wanted to sit down and try to use words to convey what it actually felt like to wind a stopwatch, which I know sounds a little funny, but I've always been a little fascinated with stopwatches and pocket watches. And I kind of collected them for a while. And just the physical feeling of holding a watch in your hand and time and winding it and feeling that little knob tick on, I've always found really interesting, really comforting. So that first scene started as an exercise, and then the rest of the story kind of grew out of it almost accidentally. I liked the character, so I gave her a name, and then I threw in like one sentence about her father, and then that sentence about her father was in the past tense, and suddenly it was post-apocalyptic.
I love it.
I kind of sat there and I went, you know what? I have things to say about post-apocalypticism. I have things to say about this genre. Sure, let's do it. And it became a really interesting exercise to keep the stopwatch relevant as an image and as a theme, because I have a lot of different perspectives. You don't really get it in that first chapter, but a lot of the subsequent chapters have 3 or 4 different viewpoints, and they're all telling the story from different angles and different perspectives. You see like important events as they happen through whichever character is most relevant to that scene. And I found that having the watch and the hours continue on as the organizing factor actually really helps keep that straight and keep it all cohesive as a storyline.
Yeah, and it's clever because they often tell you as a writer, like, have a ticking time bomb. Like, this is it. We have it. So
pretty literally.
Yeah. It's great. I think before everybody else, you guys, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, but I'm just going to keep coming up with my own questions until, you know, if someone has one, I'll bring it up. But before we got kind of, you know, on the call, we were talking a little bit about gaming and your kind of like, you know, background with that. And so I was curious, you know, what kind of games do you play and how does that kind of play? Does it impact your writing?
That is actually a really extremely relevant question. For one thing, there are at least 3 people on this call that I'm in a game with at the moment. So it is, how can I put this? I only started doing tabletop gaming about 3 years ago, honestly. It was something that I'd always kind of wanted to get into, but I never really had the opportunity to. And kind of all of a sudden at one point, I think like with the rise of Zoom and other online conferencing software, as well as like suddenly moving closer to some of my friends who game more readily than I do, it kind of became much easier and happened very suddenly. And I doubt he would actually talk if I call him out, but Daniel is the DM for one of the longest running games I'm in. Hi, Daniel. And his game is amazing.
Longest running game I'm in too.
There he is. His game and his self-made setting are amazing. They are this sort of post-apocalyptic fantasy. I don't even know how to describe it. It's fantasy, it's science fiction. It's a really amazing setting with a lot of different things happening, and you never quite know what's going to happen next. So that's definitely been a big impact. And switching gears entirely, in another game I'm in, the first character I ever made is this, it's a Dungeons & Dragons game. She is a half-orc warlock, and she was also the character about which I accidentally wrote a novella that got published last year. So very direct impact of gaming on writing there. I love my warlock girl, what can I say?
That's awesome. You should do more with it, I love it. I have a client that I do like freelance editing, and I have a client that he wrote a game guide and then wrote a whole book series around it. So I think it's a fun thing to see how that, you know, comes into being. And if we don't have any other questions, I wanted to say that if you guys are interested in, we're going to do a little book giveaway. So, you know, if you would like me to send you a copy of Meridel's book, if you don't have it already, I will send you one. So drop your email to me in the chat, or just say, hey, I want one, and I'll go look up your email from the registration. If you do want one, we'll give one away, which is exciting. I was going to say that we will be at StokerCon next week, and that is in Denver, Colorado. So if any of you guys are in the area or are going to StokerCon, we will be there, and we will have Meridel's book on our table along with our other books. This is our 9th book publication, so that's kind of exciting because we're nearly to 10. Our next book is called Level 5. It's by a Texas author, William Ledbetter. He's a Nebula Award winner, and his book was an audiobook that was a bestseller, and we will be publishing the ebook and print versions. So that's fun. It's a near future sci-fi thriller with AIs, nanobots, and apocalypse stuff. So it fits. And Daniel says, I will say the theme in your book is very resonant. I've always hated how bleak post-apocalypses are. People naturally build communities. I hope so. I want to believe in that. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. And then also, you guys, if you get a chance to review the book, it really helps if you review it on Amazon for us and other, Goodreads and other review places. That's always helpful to the press. So, but yeah, if you want a copy, guys, drop your info or let me know in the chat. And thank you so much, Meridel, for reading to us. It was like really nice. And for publishing with us. And oh, I should say, can you tell us a little vague hint at the sequel?
Oh.
I just put you on the spot.
How vague do I want to be about this? So one of the quieter themes of the first book is the idea of crafting. It's again going back to like people naturally build communities and work to stay together, and part of that is often not acknowledged is crafting and like weaving and fabric making. And I want to say that for the second book, I'm pulling in a lot more of that. I want it to be more of a more prominent theme. And I'm specifically doing a lot of research on beekeeping at the moment.
I love that. I get excited. I have a dream of having bees one day.
Oh,
like
nice.
In where I live, you can hire a bee hive or something. Like you can reach out to these people and they will come put a beehive on your property and they will like come take care of it, and so you can just have the bees there. I'm obsessed with that. So that's awesome. That is gonna be really fun to read. I'm very excited. I'm writing down all y'all's emails so I can send you copies of the book, and please forgive very slow shipping because that has been the case in Texas. Oh yeah, so much slow shipping. But that was lovely. Thank you everyone for coming. Follow Meridel and Interstellar Flight Press online, and we would love to say hi to you. If you are at a con that we're at, come say hi to us. And thanks. Yeah. So
thank you all so much for coming. It means a lot to me.
Thank you.